So today's going to be a little bit different. We're going to go ahead and talk about the Ford 6-liter Powerstroke engine, give you some thoughts on that, and why it isn't really as bad as everyone thinks it is. Before we do, let's pour ourselves a drink, and we'll go sit down and talk. This is Colonel E.H. Taylor. Pretty good stuff. If you like whiskey, give it a try. It's reasonably priced. But we'll give that a go. Alright, let's go sit down. So, full disclosure, I own a Ford Excursion with the 6-liter Powerstroke. I'm not making this video to make myself feel better. I'm going to walk you through the thought process and research that I did before I bought it. So, just so that everyone knows, I've got one of these. I put my money where my mouth is. So, the Powerstroke, the 6-liter, Ford put it in their Super Duties in the Excursions, starting in mid-year 2003. 2003 and a half is what they call it. And obviously the Excursion was done in 05, but the 6-liter was still used all the way through 07 in their Super Duties. It's got a reputation for blowing head gaskets. And I think while that does occur, that's not the actual problem. That's just the symptom of a bigger problem. And that's something that I think you can fix fairly easily. So anyone who tells you that a 6-liter needs to be studded, put head studs, ARP head studs, to replace the torque-to-yield head bolts. If someone's telling you that they need to stud it in order to make it reliable, that's nonsense. It's not correct. Under stock power levels. If you're going to mod it and go ahead and get a bunch more power, you have to stud it. But I'm not talking about modded motors right now. We're talking stock. Under stock power levels, the torque-to-yield head bolts, which I don't like that. I don't like torque-to-yield head bolts, but under stock power levels, they're fine. They do the job just fine. The problem with the 6-liter motor is the cooling system. So, unlike a lot of cars that you may be used to, the 6-liter Powerstroke has a liquid-to-liquid oil cooler. And so what that means is you have, it's actually a small cube. I changed mine out. It's probably about this big. Really, it's a small little thing. And you have 4 ports on it, an in and an out times 2. So one of those ins and outs is for the oil. The other in and out is for the coolant. What ends up happening in this oil cooler as well as the Egr Cooler, which I'll get to in a minute, is the stock Ford Gold coolant. It contains silicates, and those silicates build up in these tiny little passages on the coolant side of that oil cooler. As those passages get blocked, you get less and less flow through that cooler. And what that means is that your oil temp rises up because that coolant isn't able to go through there and pull some of that heat out and go into the water side through the radiator, all of that. So you end up with high temp on the oil, and it ends up getting you just overheating your engine and leads to blowing a head gasket because you have higher cylinder pressures due to all of this. Okay. The Egr Cooler is similar in that you have coolant going through this Egr Cooler. Again, these tiny little passageways that get blocked with silicate. It just gels up the inside of that water side. And so it restricts the flow of the water going through there, again leading to overheating and other issues, and eventually you pop a head gasket. I'm somewhat simplifying it, but that's the gist of it. So, you need to go ahead and deal with that. The first thing you need to do is you need to flush all that old coolant out. There's a chemical flush that you use. I used one from Cummins. Cat makes one. I think Ford actually makes one too. So what you do is you drain all your coolant out and flush it with water, you distilled water, and get all the coolant out. And at this point, you've still got a little bit of residue and all that gel and all that crap that's in there. So you fill up with this chemical cleaner and then top it up with distilled water. At this point, and I'm going by memory here, the directions may vary on each different chemical, but on the Cummins one, it said that I had to get it up to temp and drive it for, I want to say it was about 90 minutes. And I couldn't go over 2 hours. So I had a small window that I had to get home and drain the coolant on, okay? So you get up to temp and just keep driving around under load. Up hills is a fantastic thing. That's how you do your flush. Bring it back home, drain it, flush it. I just used hose water to flush and just kept flushing and flushing. Fill it up, run it, cycle it through, keep flushing. It just takes an afternoon because you want to get all of this old coolant out. When I'm done with that, I was left with just distilled water in there. The last bit I had filled up with distilled water. Once that's done, I had planned my next part of the fix. At that point, I'm assuming that I have a bad oil cooler because it's been in the truck for quite a while. So you need to replace that. Part's $200, but it's buried under the top of the engine. It's kind of a pain in the butt to get to. So there's another fix that you should do to solve another minor, another issue, another problem area on the early 6 liters. But regardless, go ahead and change out that oil cooler. You can use the stock one, it works fine. Or you can go do the oil to air cooler and basically bypass the one that's already in there, the Ford one, and just go with a more typical oil to air cooler if that's your thing. I actually like the liquid to liquid one. So ended up replacing that. On the early 03s, you have an EGR cooler that's actually fairly robust. Somewhere around 04 or 04 and a half, I can't remember when they made the switch, they ran into ones that were, or started installing ones that were more prone to the clogging. So they just had smaller passageways. So I didn't bother changing out my EGR cooler. I didn't have any problems with it. But anyway, replace that part. Get once your oil cooler is all replaced, now you're going to go ahead and switch over to ELC coolant. It's an extra long life coolant that they use in like 18-wheelers, semi-trucks. It's heavy duty stuff. And it's silicate free, which means it's not going to clog up those small passageways, and that's what you want. So switching over to an ELC coolant, as well as making sure that when you do that switch you have a new oil cooler, that solves 90% of your problems right there on that 6 liter. The other part that's kind of an issue on the early ones, I think 03s and 04s had this issue, and I can't remember if 05s did, but the high pressure oil pump tends to fail on these. Mine went out at about 190,000 miles. The sign that I had of a failing high pressure oil pump was it was just sluggish. So mine didn't just let go all of a sudden, but it did eventually let go. If you are replacing your oil cooler and you have a problematic high pressure oil pump, they're right next to each other. And whether you're doing it yourself or you're paying someone to do it, just knock them both out and then you won't have to worry about them again. You can replace it with a Ford part, or the smarter thing to do is go with a more durable aftermarket one. There's a ton of good ones out there. But you replace those 2 items and you're in really good shape on that engine. That's the 2 biggest problem areas: the cooling system, high pressure oil pump on the early 06s. The cooling systems across the board on the 6 liters. So you fix those 2 areas, that engine's pretty damn good. Couple of other things that pop up from time to time. People talk about turbo problems. Um, a 6-liter has a variable geometry turbo, and what ends up happening there, you can have solenoid issues or some other stuff, but a lot more common, or a very common issue, is that you'll get carbon buildup, and it prevents the vanes of that turbo from moving. Really, you just got to work the engine. You know, if you're just going around partial throttle all the time, you're not exercising those vanes, and so it allows that carbon to build up. If you mat it every once in a while, it does pretty good, because now it's moving those vanes and it knocks off any buildup before it gets to be too big of a deal. It doesn't solve a solenoid issue, but as long as that's functioning, the internals of that turbo are pretty solid. So I don't really worry about that too much. Another problem area that arises is the FICM, the fuel injection control module. So it's an easy fix, and it's one that I haven't had to worry about, but if you're keeping an eye on things, you'll know it before it fails and you can get it addressed beforehand. And so I call this a really minor issue. So Ford International actually built these engines for Ford. They placed this fuel injection control module on top of the driver's side cylinder head valve cover. And it's not a good spot because these things are sensitive to vibration and heat. And right on top of that valve cover, it's vibrating and got a lot of heat. Not really the best location for it. So what tends to happen there is the stock ones, a couple of the solder joints end up failing, and then the unit fails. Okay. So you can watch out for signs of failure, and it has to do with voltage, FICM voltage. And if that voltage drops, your truck might become hard to start, give you some issues of running, but it's a sign of a failing FICM. Go ahead and order a replacement, and return yours, you'll get your core deposit back. Pretty straightforward thing to fix. But again, I don't really see that as a big issue. The cooling issue is a big deal, and the high pressure oil pump, really the big deal. If you are going to get a 6-liter, one of the first things you need to do is get a scan gauge, or some way to monitor oil temp and water temp. And then I would also suggest FICM voltage. So a scan gauge is like $120. You plug it into the OBD port and it's set up. You can watch this stuff. If you're watching for oil and water, those temperatures should be within 10 degrees of each other when you're unloaded and just cruising on a flat. Okay? They should really track closely. They should really be around 5. But if they start separating more than 10 degrees while you're unloaded and just on a flat, you've probably got an oil cooler issue. It's clogged. So you need to plan on replacing that. I know when I switched to the ELC, my deltas went from about 5 to closer to 8. Not a big deal, but still within that 10-degree window. But they still track each other real well. On that scan gauge, you can also monitor your FICM voltage. You want it to be 48 volts. That's standard. If it drops below 47.5, you know you're starting to have an issue with that FICM. So order a replacement and get it done. Pretty simple stuff. So why would you choose the 6-liter over the 7.3? It's a better engine. It's got more power, more torque. It's got fantastic fuel economy. I want to say, on the highway, you're pushing 20 miles a gallon in an excursion. That's not bad at all. I think numbers are like 18 or so, but you're coming close to that 20 mile a gallon number. I've towed with this thing, towed heavy, through the mountains and had no issues. Yeah, and the transmission's really good. That torque shift transmission is fantastic. So I think because of that, that's why the 6 liter is actually a really good engine. And you don't have any of the emissions nonsense going on. You have the Egr Cooler, but it's not like the DPF or any of the other nonsense that comes on the later trucks that also throws a ton of problems. You don't have the regen issues where it just dumps a ton of fuel into the system to burn off all this soot. So you don't have any of that junk. It's pretty much the last of the non-emissions diesels, and it's a good, reliable engine. It's built well, and it has a very long service life. Probably, well, it is not as long as the Cummins, but you pay a huge premium on the Cummins, and you can't get the Cummins in something like an Excursion. So you get a nice power bump over the 7.3. It's a lot better as a driver, I think. So that's why I chose the 6 liter over the 7.3. As far as keeping it stock, again, everything I've said applies to stock stuff, and I haven't mentioned that you have to go do studs, because you don't. You don't need to do head studs if you keep it stock power levels. If you're going to throw a tune on it, you need to stud this engine. You can do it with the engine in place, the cab in place, but it's kind of a pain, and you got to modify one of the gearboxes just to get in there. I don't know. It can be done. You can replace each of these those head bolts with head studs one at a time. You can make it work without pulling the engine. People have done it. And if you are going to tune them, you got to do it. But if you're going to keep it stock, you're in good shape. The only thing that I've done to mine, I did an Atlas 40 tune on the FICM, which is a fuel injection. It doesn't change the cylinder pressures, so I'm fine stock with the head bolts, but it changes the fuel injection map, and it makes it a lot more responsive down low. So that's really nice. But beyond that, I've kept mine stock. The other thing I'd bring up, you've got, just as general maintenance and things to keep in mind, the boots on your air intake, and basically on both sides of the turbo, the hot side and the cold side. On both sides of the intercooler, the hot side of the intercooler, the cold side of the intercooler. The pipes going into there have these silicone boots, and those boots tend to crack over time and degrade. So when I got my truck, I had a giant hole on the bottom side of one of these and lack of power because I wasn't building any boost. So get those replaced, and it's just going to wear. So go get some good stuff and replace them. You can use Ford parts. I went aftermarket on mine with the silicone hoses, and they're nice. They're thicker. They're heavier duty. So that's a good thing to do. But just general maintenance, stay up on top of it and you're in good shape. But again, primary cause of all these problems that people talk about on the 6 liter Powerstroke comes down to the cooling system. You're probably in good shape with the factory one if you change your coolant regularly, but most people don't. And it's better to just, in my opinion, get rid of that and get a coolant that's not going to cause that problem. So that's what I did. I've had no issues with my truck related to that. Actually, I haven't had any problems with my truck other than the high pressure oil pump going out, which I did replace. And again, when I bought it cheap enough. I had planned on doing these things. So for about $2,000, you can solve problems on the 6 liter Powerstroke, and you're going to pay more than a $2,000 premium on the 7.3s. To me, you're better off getting the 6 liter. But you got to be able to do your own work or know a good mechanic, reasonable rates, that knows those engines. Because if you go just anywhere, they'll throw stuff at it, and they won't know all the signs and symptoms, and you can really, they turn into a money pit. So You just got to be aware of that. But I think the engine's a good one. I think it's a great option. I like it better than the 7.3. I have no need to focus on a maintenance or an engine that is forgiving with deferred maintenance because I'm always on top of it. But you know, if you're not in that boat, or you know, if you tend to get around to maintenance whenever you remember instead of on a schedule, you know, maybe the 7.3 is better for you. But it's not my case. Anyway, that's my thoughts on that 6-liter Powerstroke. Hopefully someone found it a little bit useful. Like I said, I own one. I put my money where my mouth is. And it's been trouble-free. So take that for what it's worth. Do your own research if you're thinking about getting one. See if you agree with what I said. Anyway, take care, guys.